Good morning. Did you see all the pretty tulips on the sign behind me and all the pretty tulips out there? It's really a great time of year to be in Holland. My name is Claudia Berry, and I want to welcome you all, those of you in person and those of you who are streaming in. First reminder is to please turn off your cell phones. Check your purse, check your pockets. If you choose to take notes on your phone, make sure you put it into the silent position. Therefore, you won't disturb the people around you with your clicking on your phone. And remember, this is a T-coil for all of you, like I do, who wear hearing aids. If you have a T-coil, you should turn it on. It will help with your hearing, and especially hearing our speaker. Our membership is at a total of 816 members, and we are very, very proud of that. Couple of announcements for us this morning before we begin, but first I'll tell you, the speaker is in the house. We have two things that, as members, we can help and do. The first is our Distinguished Service Award. This was instituted in 1992, and the Distinguished Service Award seeks to recognize a member who has displayed exemplary service to our organization, Hope College, and the Holland area community. Someone who embraces the peer-led mission of HASP to provide lifelong learning opportunities that enrich the intellectual, cultural, and social lives of our members. If you know of someone, please check the most recent HASP happenings, and there is a link there. The Executive Committee of HASP is the ones who make the decision, and we will be deciding that after May 9th. So your deadline, if you know of someone you would like to nominate, please check your HASP happenings and submit your nomination. The second is, did you know that HASP has service grants? And service grants are available for members of 1 year who volunteer in a nonprofit organization. For your grant, you can request up to $200 for any out-of-pocket expense for a service project that the nonprofit you were involved in has done. Again, check your HASP happenings, and there is a link to the grant and to apply for it. And those grants are decided by the service committee. Now, I think you all have noticed that parking was at a premium today. And that's because tulip time has arrived, and that is affecting several of our parking places. And they will be affected from Monday, which was yesterday, until Monday, May 12th. So please look around for signage in posted areas, and remember that these parking places have now been taken over by the food vendors. So if you enjoy an elephant ear, or Polish sausage, or Blue Star barbecue, you will be able to now get it and find the location in one of our parking places. I have to tell you, for many of us who have lived in Holland a long time, we have a fond name for the food trucks. We call them the gut wagons, because while you are enjoying the food, it stays in your gut a long time. So if you want to absorb that, so my whole family now, they say, oh, have the gut wagons arrived? And I'll say, yes. Now here is something very, very important for special events. Mark your calendars. At noon on June 18th, we will be opening the reservations. Are you ready? For 2 events. The first is the Stratford Festival in September, and then the closing of the Grand in October. Those are very special events. We know that a lot of people have interest in them, and space is limited. So be at your computer at noon and type in your reservation. We will have no monthly program in May. Our next monthly program will be the annual business meeting on Tuesday, June 10th, and this is going to be a sit-down breakfast at the Boltman Center, which is connected to DeWitt on Hope's campus. Look for reservations and registration in HASP happenings. The breakfast is free, the annual business meeting free to all members, but you do need to register because space is limited. And now, on with our program today. The presenter and I talked, and she gave me a wonderful phrase to start this. The second time is the charm. HASP monthly program today is on the importance of community, listening, and empathy. Listening is a disappearing art form, and when practiced with empathy, has the power to transform a community. This is important. We're going to need to learn this. What is empathy? How does it create community and connection? Empathy is on decline, but don't despair, it is a growable skill. What is empathetic listening, and how do you score? And we all, if you miss getting an inventory sheet, which the presenter will use at the end of her presentation, please raise your hand if you did. They were handing them out at the door. And we will do an empathetic listening inventory. Our presenter, Anna Bonema, is the director of HOPE's Fostering a Community of Excellence in Science, acronym FACES. Anna enjoys meeting students for cups of tea in her office or lattes at Lamangelo's. In addition to FACES, she teaches a first-year seminary each fall and a senior seminary in the spring. She is also completing a practicum to become a spiritual director. Anna is the mother of teenage triplets and enjoys hiking, reading, and curling up with her dog. Please join me in welcoming Anna Bonema.
I'm here. Thank you so much for the grace to have me back for the second time. Well, my first time, your second time. I appreciate that very much. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. My name is Anna Bonema, and I have been working at Hope College for about 16 years. My current title, and I really love this title, so I'm going to share it with you, is Associate Professor of Holistic Student Success and Belonging. Isn't that amazing? I love it so much. I sit in a STEM field with an upper class peer mentor, so an older student, also from an underrepresented group who is going through the same thing. The goals of the program are to create community and belonging, to make connections, to help the students make connections to the Natural and Applied Sciences Division, the campus, as well as the wider Holland community. The program has evolved over the years, often changing with the times or the current needs of the students. For instance, this year, I was really interested to see that the events that were the most popular, the most attended by students, were the ones that had a creative bend to them. And these are all STEM students, serious science students. And what they wanted was to come to events where one of them we made little tiny mini magazines, and one we painted. And I just a few weeks ago did a journaling, a writing workshop, but not writing papers, giving them creative writing prompts. And those were what the students were craving. Typically, we'll meet once a month, sometimes a little more, but then the students connect with their peer mentors in between our meetings. I would love to think that it's the fabulous programming that I put so much thought into that make the program a success, but I'm really realistic in that it is really the interactions with the peer mentors, someone who has potentially walked a similar situation to what they are experiencing, and they can ask questions. Students do also get to connect with me, and this happens very often, as was mentioned, over cups of tea in my office or mugs of coffee, as David likes to call it, at my other office, Lamangelo's. Sometimes when I leave in the morning, my husband says, "How many different meetings do you have at Lamangelo's today?" And I just laugh and say, "I never said I had a bad job." I do only limit myself to one latte a day, though. If I meet more than one student there, I have to switch to tea, because that would not go well. Early in my time at Hope, I read a quote about how a major determiner of a young adult's continued spirituality after college is that they have a non-family member adult with whom to discuss some of these things that they're wrestling with, questions or thoughts about spirituality or faith. At the time, I thought, this is me. This is what I do. Since I actually said it out loud, the people around me, the full-time, maybe more research-oriented faculty, were surprised. And they said, "It is?" Early on, I found the need for listening to be so high at Hope College. And so many students wanted to have these really deep conversations around spirituality and faith. And at the time, I was thinking, well, my background, my undergraduate degree, is in animal behavior and neurobiology. So I'm not sure how incredibly qualified I feel to talk about these deep spiritual questions with students, which is what kind of brought me into that spiritual direction practicum at the Dominican Center in Grand Rapids. And I have actually completed that. I now teach in that program. I'm there about 20 hours a month as well. But it was that kind of listening that drew me to that program. And it was something I realized early on at Hope College. Students don't shy away from hard conversations. They want to have them. But they really need to feel that they're in a safe space, in a space where they can be heard and respected. And sometimes it's not advice that they're looking for. It's just someone who will sit with them. Listening well has always been an important part of my life. My dad always taught me that each person has a story to tell. My mom, growing up, would bring in people from all different backgrounds and cultures to our home throughout my childhood. In 2017, I was tasked with creating a senior seminar, and I began preparing a talk on how important listening is to me and my life. I don't know if any of you know the wonderful Jonathan Haygood, but he was the one who kind of put me up to this challenge, and he proposed that I create a faith and scholarship talk. And I politely responded via email that I was Catholic and I don't do research at Hope. So as far as Hope goes, I don't really have faith or scholarship. He very politely discounted every single thing that I said. And the next thing I knew, I was standing in front of a room of people giving said talk on faith and scholarship. He could do things like that. The talk became the foundation of my class, The Art of Listening. Now, if I do say so myself, it is now one of the most sought-after classes at Hope College. In fact, I think I personally broke the waitlist system. Hopefully there's nobody from the registrar's office here. I can't see you. You're all just a blur of faces. But the waitlist at Hope College had to do a little change because of my class, I think. So anyway, every single semester, though, I wonder if the draw will decrease. Perhaps the need for a class on listening, on making space, on being present, on listening when it's hard, will become less important because society will be getting better at it. So far, that is not the case. I would venture to say that the opposite has actually been true every year. And each semester, the need for good listeners becomes more and more dire. I have the privilege of bookending the college experience and also teach a first-year seminar in the fall. I've taught a few iterations of that class. The current one is probably my favorite, and it's titled Matthew 25, When I was hungry, when I was thirsty, where were you? And in this class, we examine the also decreasing skill, I'm a glutton for punishment, I think, of empathy. We walk through the verse, when I was hungry, when I was in prison, when I was a stranger, and we learn about each population. And we examine our own levels of empathy towards that population as we progress. We consider what it means to show empathy to our neighbors, even if they are unhoused, addicted, or from a different place. My mentoring program, 2 classes, all weave together, sharing students across the board. I'll have mentoring students in my classes. I will have students from my classes that I meet with on other projects. By sharing content and planning events, I can model the skills of listening well and empathy. I get to teach about some of the most important values in my life and have honest conversations with students as to how this looks in the real world, in my life outside of the classroom. That's one of their favorite questions to ask is, but what does this really look like? Like, how do you actually live this out? Talk about needing to stay on your game. So I'm going to share with you today some thoughts about listening to people in pain, pulling together pieces from my senior seminar on listening, my first year seminar on empathy, and my 16 years experience walking alongside students of color at a primarily white institution. I will share some of the things we read, some of the things I ask students to think about, and how I frame these topics, and what it looks like at a Christian institution. Are you ready for class? Let's begin. One of the things I teach my college seniors about listening is the importance of considering who you are listening to and how their experiences might be different than yours. This could come out in so many ways, one of which is that a simple word that you use could mean something different to them. It is important, when listening well, to consider that a word, even a very common word, could mean different things to different people. To emphasize this, I begin each class by asking my students to journal for a few moments about a seemingly ordinary, everyday word. And then I read them a short essay by the amazing David White about that very word from his book, Consolations, the solace, nourishment, and underlying meaning of everyday words. My hope is that the contrast between what they wrote and what he uncovers will remind them that nuances exist and we must be aware when we listen. So for just a moment, I would love for you to think about the word silence. You don't have to journal about it, but this would be what I would do with my class. Think about the word silence. What does it mean to you? What does it conjure in your mind? What does it remind you of? So just spend a moment thinking about the word silence. And then as I do with my students, I'm going to read to you this little short essay from David White on silence so that we can think about how a very common word could evoke different thoughts. Silence is frightening, David White says. An intimation of the end, the graveyard of fixed identities. Real silence puts any present understanding to shame, orphans us from certainty, leads us beyond the well-known and accepted reality, and confronts us with the unknown and previously unacceptable conversation about to break in upon our lives. Silence does not end skepticism, but makes it irrelevant. Belief or unbelief or any previously rehearsed story meets the wind in the trees, the distant horn in the busy harbor, or the watching eye and listening ear of a puzzled loved one. In silence, essence speaks to us of essence itself and asks for a kind of unilateral disarmament, our own essential nature slowly emerging as the defended periphery atomizes and falls apart. As the busy edge dissolves, we begin to join the conversation through the portal of a present unknowing, robust vulnerability, revealing in the way we listen a different ear, a more perceptive eye, an imagination refusing to come too early to a conclusion, and belonging to a different person than the one who first entered the quiet. Out of the quiet emerges the sheer incarnational presence of the world, a presence that seems to demand a moving internal symmetry in the one breathing and listening equal to its own breathing, listening, elemental powers. To become deeply silent is not to become still, but to become tidal and seasonal, a coming and going that has its own imitable, essential character, a story not fully told, like the background of the sea, or the rain falling, or the river going on, out of sight, out of our lives. Reality met on its own terms demands absolute presence and absolute giving away, an ability to live on equal terms with the fleeting and the eternal, the hardly touchable and the fully possible, a full bodily appearance and disappearance, a rested giving in and giving up, another identity braver, more generous and more here than the one looking hungrily for the easy, unearned answer. Is that what you were thinking? You should see my students' faces when I read some of these. They're like, what did she just say? But it gives them a different perspective, right? It helps them to see that even these common words, and now he has 2 different editions of this book, but words like self-knowledge, shadow, work, denial, despair, alone, joy, simple words, right? It's important for us to think about what they might mean to someone else. But I chose this word intentionally today, and it's actually one of the first words that I use with my students. And I start with silence because one of the best ways to prepare yourself to listen well is through time and silence. Getting comfortable with silence places us in a good position to listen well. So I would ask you, how comfortable are you with silence? My students, not comfortable with silence. Throughout the course of my semester, I require the seniors to do 1 hour in silence, 2 consecutive hours in silence, and 3 consecutive hours in silence, and they do not like it. Most of them don't like it at all. One student went so far as to write in her reflection, "I was really angry when I got this assignment." And I was like, well, I guess full honesty. It's scary to them. They're not used to it. It's something very different than their experience of a world that is constantly giving us noise and feedback. So I talked to them about how to spend some time in silence to ease themselves into it, maybe with nature or poetry. I encourage them not to pick up a novel and read for the whole 3 hours, even though that sounds wonderful. But that's just filling your head with different words, with someone else's words. Though I will admit that when I went on my first silent retreat, I showed up with a gigantic suitcase full of books. In fact, I had to take the elevator to the 2nd floor because the suitcase was so heavy, only to learn that that was not really the intention of the time. So as I mentioned before, listening well is a skill that's becoming more vital with every single passing day. In a time of great polarization and separation, a time of great misunderstanding and hurt, listening well is essential. And in order to listen well, we must make space. So here we are as we look to the end of 1 month and the beginning of another, as we start to look ahead towards the season of summer. This is a good time, I think, for all of us here to think about what it might look like for us to make space to listen well, to slow and to clear away. And to look at this, let's look at someone who I consider to be a really strong example of this kind of living, and that's Jesus. One of the interesting things I've observed in teaching at a Christian college over the years is the way students respond to the idea of using Jesus as a model human. So I do teach a lot of Christian students who've been taught or talked to about how we should perhaps listen for the voice of God or Jesus. But I rarely find any student who has considered Jesus as an example for listening. I also teach a fair amount of non-Christian students, even students who have experienced pretty severe religious trauma. These are students who sign up for this class where it's very clear in the syllabus that there will be some Jesus talk, and yet they come, right? By now, most of them are seniors, and so they're used to kind of walking the walk at Hope College. But I do find that by gently introducing them to the human example of Jesus and what he can teach us, that students say that often feels safe. I've even had multiple students say to me, "Well, I like your Jesus." That's just Jesus. The chapter in the book that I use to teach my seniors, which is The Listening Life by Adam McHugh, actually contrasts Jesus' listening to the earthly kings and politicians and how they listen. I can't make this up. Last fall, this chapter fell the day after the debate. The day after the debate. I thought, oh, I don't know what's going to happen now. But they had a good example to talk about. So think about for a moment. Think about the earthly examples of people in power and how they model listening. Think about the images and the news feeds and the clips that our children and grandchildren see. Think about what we see, what we're inundated with. And then I invite students to think about a different leader. And we think of how Jesus lived and what he has to teach us. One example that I share with students is from the story of Bartimaeus, which can be found in Mark 10:46-51. It says, "Then they came to Jericho, and as Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, 'Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me.' Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, possibly that he was a drain on the resources, the attention, and the time. But he shouted all the more, 'Son of David, have mercy on me.' Jesus stopped and said, 'Call him.' So they called to the blind man, 'Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling.' Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. 'What do you want me to do for you?' Jesus asked him. The blind man said, 'Rabbi, I want to see.'" Jesus' actions in this story show us that he stopped. He stood still. He didn't try to keep listening as he walked past. It also shows us that he didn't shy away from this man who was clearly not from the upper class or the good crowd. The question that he asks as well, "What do you want me to do for you?" also illustrates a listener with a servant heart. He asked Bartimaeus a question that surely servants ask those who employ them. The question illustrates the humility of Jesus as he listened. He didn't presume to know the answer, although he might have. But he shows us how vital the humble posture is to listening. We have so many other examples. Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well shows us how Jesus listened deep. In that story, this woman who had been harmed by so many kept trying to keep her defenses up and keep that conversation on the surface level because she was not going to let anyone go deeper because she knows that that will hurt. And yet Jesus gently asked questions that allowed her to go deeper in trust. It's also important to look at who Jesus listened to. As with Bartimaeus, they were not just the people in his social circle or that moved in the right crowd or lived in the good neighborhood. He listened to the woman with the hemorrhage. He let her touch him, and he didn't freak out. The tax collectors, Samaritans, beggars, prostitutes, he listened widely. In this section, we also discuss other earthly leaders who model humble listening, who model deep, present listening, who model listening to those outside of our social circles. And it often takes students a long time to think of someone in power who listens this way. Think for a moment yourselves. Does anyone come to mind for you? If so, I would encourage you to make a note and to read up a little more on that person and to learn ways to emulate their listening style. By slowing down and making space, we set the stage for listening well. One of my students who ended up at Princeton Seminary, I'm just saying, this is very cool. She wrote in a paper for me that never once in the Bible do we see Jesus rushing past or rolling his eyes in frustration when someone asked for his time. And yet, how often do we check our phone? I have to, because you guys have to leave. I could talk about this all day, but they said that's not okay. So I have to check my phone. But in a listening situation, how often do we check our phone or allow ourselves to become distracted by the ever-rolling list of the next thing we need to get done? I teach this, I live this, and yet it's still hard for me. About a year ago, I was at my other office, Lamangelo's, and as you might expect, as has been alluded to, I know a lot of people there, and quite well. And so I was wrapping up my work there for the day and was heading towards the door, and I even was leaning towards the door. And someone that I knew well from there came past, and I said to them, "Oh, hi, how are you?" With my hand on the door, started to turn my head towards the door and away from the person, when out of the corner of my ear, I heard their response, depressed and self-loathing, in this quiet voice. I had my hand on the door. There is an iteration of this story where I was halfway back to my office before I processed what that response was. But thankfully, in that moment, I didn't. I processed it, took my hand off the door, turned, and entered into a conversation with my friend. I teach this, I live this, and I was almost so distracted by what I needed to get done next that was of so much less importance that I almost missed that opportunity. Or how often do we allow ourselves to take on a position? This is a hard one. Are you ready? How often do we allow ourselves to take on a position of the one who already knows the answer? Who is already preparing our response long before our friend has finished speaking? How much do we miss of what's being said while we are prepping our response in our mind? All these things take away our presence, our attention, our ability to listen deep and wide. One of the things that always comes up to my students when we talk about this is how often we're preparing our responses before the other person is finished speaking. You're going to see that on that empathetic listening inventory, and that one gets me every time. And I take this inventory twice a year, and it still gets me every time. Part of the reason that we do this, though, is our lack of humility, but also our dislike for silence. If we wait until the person has finished speaking, we have to pause to decide what type of response is needed, or if any response is needed. And again, back to that silence. Silence is scary and countercultural. If we have to wait a moment, we feel like that is completely unacceptable. And yet that's what we're called to do in good listening. We let someone finish, then we rest with what has been said, and we discern what response is needed. We have to incorporate silence, and this is slow, so we have to slow the pace way down. One of the things that I find we, myself included, struggle with the most is listening to people who are hurting or struggling. Adam McHugh, the author of the book, The Listening Life, I tried to grab it under here, and I'm going to grab something else. Okay. I love this book. Can you see? There's 60,000 little Post-it. My student said, "Can I borrow your book for a minute?" And I was like, "Oh, yeah, you're going to love it." Okay. So the author, Adam McHugh, I should know this by now, ordained Presbyterian. I think I always call him Episcopalian, so I'm probably offending someone somewhere. He is ordained Presbyterian minister and spiritual director. And he talks about the fact that Christians, and he is one, so I feel like he has the right to criticize, might actually be the worst at listening to people in pain because of the ability to shut people down so quickly with platitudes. While many people might believe that the platitudes are true, right? You might believe that God does indeed have a plan, and that maybe you believe this is truly in God's hands, and it will truly work out for the good. No one ever wants to hear that when they are in the depths of despair. Without putting yourself into too much of an uncomfortable situation, recall for a moment a time you had been hurting and had one of these or a similar platitude shared with you. Did it feel good? I ask this question to class after class after class of students, and without fail, the answer has been, it felt horrible. Do you remember me talking about the population of students I have who've experienced religious trauma or who are no longer Christian? Often, it's related to something like this, something that happened and how it was handled. So why do Christians share these things in the first place? We have a need as Christians and as humans, a deep-seated need to resolve the problem before we walk away. This is not unique to Christians, but Adam McHugh says that it's extra prevalent, but I do think it's a human character trait. If we are just passing by at the grocery store, we want badly to fix it before we walk away because we cannot handle the unresolved. And yet, in these moments of hurt, disappointment, and pain, what we need, what our friends and family members need, what those in our neighborhood and community need, is for someone who just sits by their side. That's it. Stays there. Adam McHugh says, someone who is willing to enter the storm with them and get soaked. To be present, to stop, to be still, to be. Easier said than done. The professors I've spoken to about this, probably some of you might have been professors before you retired, so you might be able to relate. I can make a room full of professors squirm in their seat like you cannot imagine when I say this. Because you see, they've gotten where they are, and many of you got where you are in your professional life and career by having the right answer, right? By asking a question and getting the right answer. So then, when I tell people that maybe they don't need to have the right thing to say or the right answer to fix the problem, it's really hard to take in. And yet what we're called to do is to enter the liminal space with them, with the person who's hurting. The fall after the murder of George Floyd, I was asked to talk at a variety of department meetings in the natural and applied sciences. This was a little bit ironic to me because I'd been doing the same work for about 10 years at that point. I had never been asked this question before. So it was very interesting, and yet I took it as an opportunity to be able to go in and speak about, with my students' permission, their experiences as students of color at Hope College. The professors wanted to know how to do this being, what do we do if there's a racial incident and there are students who come to us who are hurting because of it? They wanted me to give them a script with the exact right thing to say that they could stick on their desk so they would have ready for those students. But when I talked to my students, what the students wanted from their faculty or staff when things like this happened was to know that they were here. They wanted their faculty to acknowledge that there was hurting and pain. And they wanted them to not try to have the right answer or fix the problem, but maybe to just sit in that space with them. To have this acknowledged in a classroom setting was such a big request by the students. For them to just say that there was a racial incident that happened and that that's not okay with me and it's not how I live, and I know that there are people on this campus who are hurting right now. One of the things that I say to my students is, if this isn't something that's affecting your life right now, that's a privilege, and be aware that it is impacting the lives of other people on this campus. The students wanted their professors, their faculty, their staff to enter the liminal space with them. I have so many marks in here, I don't know which mark I'm supposed to be reading. Okay, I found it. Adam McHugh says, if I want to be a comfort to a person in pain, I must be able to wander in the liminal space with them. I will take their pain and the tension that it creates seriously. I will take this moment that you are currently in with all its meaning, uncertainty, doubt, and pain seriously, because you are loved right now. Everything that you bring to the table without filter or editing or resolution has significance. Listening is not a reward for good behavior or proper doctrine. I am not waiting for you to be fixed, say things perfectly, believe what I do, or see things as I do before I listen to you. If Jesus had listened like that, he would have spent a lot of time alone. So let's talk about the role of empathy. In 2006, that was a long time ago. Things have happened since then. But in 2006, Barack Obama said that the United States was suffering from an empathy deficit. And I would say it's only gotten worse from there. The University of Michigan did a study that showed the average person in 2009, again, we've been through some things since then. The average person in 2009 was less empathetic than 75% of the people in 1979. Jamil Zaki, a professor of psychology at Stanford, wrote an amazing book called The War for Kindness, Building Empathy in a Fractured World, and he explains some of the cause for this shocking data in the introduction of his book. He states, the modern world has made kindness harder. He explains, as cities grow and households shrink, we see more people than ever before, but we know fewer of them. Rituals that bring us into regular contact, attending church, participating in sports, even grocery shopping, have given way to solitary pursuits, often carried out over the internet. At a corner store, two strangers can make small talk about basketball, school systems, or video games, getting to know all sorts of details about each other. Online, the first thing we encounter about a person is often the thing we'd like least about them, such as an ideology we despise. They are enemies before they have a chance to be people. He goes on to say, if you wanted to design a system to break empathy, you could scarcely do better than the society we've created. This is not the end of my talk, though. The good news is that empathy is a choice, and it can be practiced and exercised, and it will grow. Another book that has changed the conversations, this should be the only one left, I can grab it, with the students I have is called Brave Souls. And hey, this would be a good speaker to have come in because she's from Grand Rapids. But her name is Belinda Bauman. She climbed Mount Kilimanjaro with a bunch of women. So I always tell her, I will follow you anywhere but not up Mount Kilimanjaro. She is amazing. But I use this book with my freshmen. And it's actually the first book we read in my class on empathy because it looks at the role and responsibility we as Christians or as humans have to respond with empathy to the hungry, sick, imprisoned, those in poverty in our community. On my first day of class with my freshmen, I asked the students to put in their journal, in their own words, what empathy means. I asked them to cite a time that they felt empathy, and then also a time that they showed empathy. And then we read the book and use it as a thread that weaves throughout the semester. At the start of each of those sections, for example, when I was hungry, when we look at poverty, I ask the students in their journal to reflect on how their personal level of empathy, what their personal level of empathy looks like for people who are unhoused. Then we learn about them. We learn the stories of the humans who are living with insecure housing or food. We learn the stories of the people who walk alongside them. And at the end of each unit, students write a short paper and cite examples of where in our readings they saw examples of empathy so that they can visualize it. I also ask them to explain how their feelings of empathy may have changed towards that population. At the end of the semester, I ask them to revisit their initial definition of empathy. And the results are shocking, although maybe not that shocking. In the 4 or 5 years I've been teaching this iteration of the class, the results have shown that most of the students at the start of the semester do not have any real idea what empathy was at all as college freshmen. I have a student in my senior sem I'm just finishing up right now who I had as a freshman, and he just felt safe enough now, 4 years later, to disclose to me that, well, he also said he didn't remember signing up for my class, but we're gonna let that go because he came back and wanted to take my senior sem. So I was trying, the other students were like, why are you telling her that? But besides that, he said, yeah, when you started talking, I said, I have no idea what empathy is. I don't even know what she's talking about. And then he realized that he needed to do some things differently. As I mentioned earlier, the class I teach these freshmen is Matthew 25. When I was hungry, when I was thirsty, where were you? This is the description that said student doesn't remember signing up for. But I often get students who are interested in learning about us being called to love our neighbor and showing compassion, right? Like all of these wonderful things. But there are always a few who I swear see a Bible verse in the title and think, Bible, I know this, I know the Bible, this is the class for me. And when they arrive, suddenly we're talking about empathy and compassion and feeding the hungry. And more than one student has innocently asked, this is in the Bible? I love it, though. That's my favorite. I may or may not have referred to it as a bait and switch with David, but we'll just... So back to empathy. Belinda Bauman explains empathy as leaning into the situation, perspective, and feelings of others so that we can act for the good of all. Leaning into the situation, perspective, and feelings of others so that we can act for the good of all. So what does this have to do with listening? Everything. I would argue that the dire need for good listening in our society goes hand in hand with the decline in empathy. Further, we cannot truly be good listeners without empathy. If we look again at the example of Jesus as a human, when his friend Lazarus died, his first response was to weep. He knew the pain. Those were his friends. Mary and Martha and Lazarus were his friends. When I was in the Holy Land with a crazy priest, he said this is where Jesus could let his hair down and have an extra glass of wine. These were his people. So he knew the pain. And he leaned into the situation, the perspective, and the feelings of others. John tells us Jesus was deeply moved in spirit. And then he raised him from the dead. But first, he showed empathy. He wept. So let's combine the two and consider for a moment empathetic listening. Again, Belinda Bauman says this is doing two things. It connects the mind and the heart to the person speaking, and it seeks to understand before being understood. Prayer of St. Francis, anybody? To be an empathetic listener takes practice and goes beyond a list of instructions, and yet having some things to consider can be really powerful. In her chapter on empathetic listening, Belinda Bauman gives the following 3 suggestions. Listen before you listen. That means be sure you're in a distraction-free place. Put down your phone. Actually, put it all the way away. Research shows that even if it's face down in front of you on the table, it's pulling your attention. Is it loud where you are? Move somewhere quieter. Allow yourself to be truly present. Second, she says, we discover the person we think we know. Empathetic listening is about trying to find out who the speaker is, not who we think she is. This involves setting aside bias and cultivating a curiosity to understand what's being said, not just what we expect to hear. Finally, be vulnerable. This goes back to listening in that servant posture, removing perceived superiority and kneeling low with the humility to listen with openness. I love Belinda Bauman's words, letting go of the need to be correct and to react instead of consider. So the empathetic listening inventory is the paper that you received on the way in, and that is going to be something that I let you take with you to do in the essence of time, but it comes from the appendix of this book, and it is a really beautiful tool for figuring out what you can work on and how you can grow this empathetic listening practice. So I want to leave you with a quote and then some homework, and then hopefully we'll have time for a question or two. So this is hard work. In the times that we're living in, some of you may have even heard empathy is sort of on the attack. It's even possibly being considered a sin by some. So this is hard work, but it is so, so worth it. Belinda Bauman talks about in her book how listening can heal us, how it can heal people. The first time I read this, tears streamed down my face. And this is why I do this work. Empathetic listening can heal our bodies. The hippocampus is the seahorse-shaped part of the brain that controls the communication of memory, decision-making, and warning signs. In cases of trauma, especially sexual trauma, The hippocampus can shrink by as much as 10 to 14%. Physical and emotional violence can affect a survivor's cognitive abilities long after the act is done, leaving a seemingly impossible road to recovery. Language centers go offline, leaving the survivor unable to answer the question, "What happened to you?" Decision-making is impaired, leaving the traumatized victims helpless to make informed choices at the moment they most need to. But this, when someone who experienced trauma shares their story with someone who genuinely listens, the brain actually regenerates itself. The brain actually regenerates itself. Much like a listening first aid, over time, the hippocampus can be restored to its original size and health. If that's not a reason to do this work, right? I'm a teacher, so you didn't think you'd get away without homework, did you? A couple of thoughts for you. What is your relationship to silence? Can you make more space for silence in your life? Intentional space, so that you can start to become more comfortable with it, so that you can bring it into your conversations and discussions. I'm a huge proponent of silent retreats, and I could talk about those for at least 4 hours, which is ironic, probably. But I've been on one. The longest silent retreat I went on was Sunday to Friday, so I would love to talk to you more about silent retreats. But it doesn't have to be that big. It could be an hour or two of silence. It could be 30 minutes of silence. It could be a silent prayer practice or meditation practice. How can you make silence a part of your everyday life? Can you practice being totally present when you listen, keeping your focus on the words people speak with curiosity and wonder, not formulating a response? Spend time with your empathetic listening inventory. Talk about it with a friend or a partner or a neighbor. Hold each other accountable. Where can you do better? As we enter into the new month of May, is there something you want to practice in May from that inventory that can be a goal for you? Because remember, if we exercise our empathy muscle, if we go out of our way to practice empathy, it can grow. And Lord knows we need it. Thank you very much. No time? I think we have time for a few questions, but I told David to only pick people that are going to ask good, not too hard questions.
Hey, baby, not too hard question.
Could you speak a minute about compassion fatigue?
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of us have been very empathetic listeners for a long time.
Yeah.
And it's sort of becoming a little hard.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that is such a good question, and judging by the people who self-select to be in a room like this is probably something that most of you are wondering about. I have had to really be intentional about creating boundaries and space. I will literally look at my calendar, and if I know I have a student who I'm meeting with who is going through some hard things and I know that conversation is going to be difficult, I will block off time afterwards to make sure I can have space. I also keep a list of things that fill me. There's an author I love, she calls it a frivolous list. She's kind of like taking back the word frivolous, because frivolous to us seems like things we don't need, but this is really stuff that pours in and brings us joy. And so I keep a frivolous list, and those are things that I go to when I know I'm starting to feel depleted. Highly recommend poetry, nature, movement, and spending time with people who care about, that you care about, who can fill you. Be aware of what fills you, be aware of what depletes you, and really be intentional about that balance. It's okay to say, can we have this conversation later? Can we have this conversation tomorrow? Sometimes my husband wants to have a really deep conversation at 10 p.m. when I am like just about done. And so because we have a trusting relationship, I can say, I don't have the bandwidth right at this exact moment to give you the attention you need. Could we talk about this in the morning? So be an advocate, but I would encourage everyone to keep a list of things that fill you and step into that as often as you can in times such as these. Thank you.
How would you distinguish sympathy from empathy? And in the background of that question is sometimes people will say, well, you didn't hear me, and what they mean is you didn't agree with me.
Yes, that is so true. I think sympathy is a feeling that you have for someone without entering into any of that experience. I think sympathy can be an experience that you have without knowing the whole story. Empathy, I think, is more of a deep feeling where you have been more open with curiosity to hear that person's perspective and their experience. So I think the differentiation is in the depth of sharing of the experience, right? We might have sympathy if someone loses someone they love, but if we sit and talk about that experience and the relationship and what happened, it might form into something deeper, more of an empathetic experience. I think in this day and age with listening and agreeing, I think part of the problem is that people do not think that there is listening unless someone has changed their mind. And that has been something really big that I've been talking to my students about, is entering in, being willing to enter into a conversation doesn't mean either of you are going to walk away having a new opinion, but just a deeper understanding. And so I think being able to lay those things out even before a conversation, if you're sitting down with someone who you know might feel that way, saying something like, I'm curious because I want to understand where you're coming from. This doesn't mean that I'm going to change how I'm feeling, nor do I expect you to, but let's just enter into this curiosity. And so sometimes, unfortunately, maybe we have to specify that being listened doesn't mean changing someone's mind. It means being curious and understanding the why behind it. Oh yeah, we're doing good.
You showed some books and articles there for references, but how can I know what they are? I can't see from here what they are.
No, you cannot. Can we
way to
share it?
really know what they are?
What, David?
We can
Yes.
circulate it by email.
Perfect. I will make sure that you have access to those.
Do you have any thoughts on seeking a mentor or seeking a mentee?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I ask my students to do when we think about empathy is to look for people who are doing this work. And I had mentioned looking for people who are listening well. And so I think when it comes to listening and empathy, I think that is a really beautiful way to have a mentoring relationship, is to know someone who is living in this way. I think I am a strong proponent in mentoring in the relationship that can be formed in being a presence for someone who you can walk alongside and navigate journeys with. I always talk to my mentors about, like, they're not supposed to always have the right answers or always pretend that they've had the right answers. There's so much power in hearing from a mentor about a struggle or a time when you maybe failed or didn't do something well, and how did you recover from that? And so I think that being in a mentoring relationship is such a powerful, powerful thing to do. I think I would love to have more engagement if there's anybody in here who had a background in STEM. And if you would like to meet with some of my students, I would love that. I think that could be a beautiful mentoring type of relationship, but I'm a huge proponent in mentoring. And I think even for all of us who are often now in a role of being the mentors, looking for people who do this work well and finding a mentor for yourself, I think is also really beautiful. And not just being only the one who is the mentor. Thank you all so much.
Anna? Anna, thank you very, very much. You've given us some very good things to think about, thoughtful, and to really think about that word silence. And that is hard for me because I always want to fill in the conversations when there is nothing happening. And so I know for myself, I'm going to practice silence. May only be 5 or 10 minutes a day right now, but that's my goal. So I thank you. I want to remind you, June 18th, noon, if you want to register for Stratford or closing of the Graham. And then June 10th, we will have our annual business meeting, and this year you will need to register because we are providing a buffet breakfast before the meeting, and there will be no cost. So have a wonderful May. We'll see you in June, and go out and enjoy the tulips along with all the visitors that come to our city. Thank you.